Wife's shocking betrayal on our dream vacation. I think, especially for people who have been married for a long time, fantasies play a big role in sexual relationships, and I am absolutely convinced that many married women like to imagine all sorts of things, but would never cheat on their husbands even in real life. We have been married for almost 18 years now and have long since moved past the fantasy stage. Needless to say, my thoughts usually involve situations involving Mary and other men, which turns me on more and more over the years. She happily consents to it in our bed, but it all ends outside the bedroom door. In real life, until recently, I have only had 2 genuine experiences of this nature. The first time was 4 years ago when we rented a chalet for a week. The weather was glorious, and we spent a lot of time in the pool with the kids. We became friends with 2 other couples and often sat together by the pool. On the first day, when Mary climbed out of the water and headed towards me, I suddenly realized that I could see her body through her swimsuit. My first reaction was to tell her so, but I stopped myself and immediately began to feel aroused by imagining other men looking at her. The next time she went to the pool, I went with her and submerged myself underwater to watch. Sure enough, when the suit was very wet, her body was clearly visible. But a few seconds after she came out of the water, nothing was visible. But what an exciting week I had. I had been on a roll the whole time, and I managed to pick out the men who noticed her and tried to keep their eyes on her to be able to get a good look at her when she came out of the water. Among them were, of course, the 2 husbands we had befriended. Unfortunately, the exposure to her breasts didn't help, but my second real experience was with her specifically, and also while on vacation. Last year I had a late week and we rented another cottage on the south coast, just the 2 of us, as the kids weren't really keen to leave with us anymore, and we wanted some peace and quiet anyway. There was no pool. She has a new suit anyway, much less revealing. But the weather was glorious, and we spent most of our time on the secluded beach with the rest of the cottage dwellers. There were about a dozen cottages here, mostly 1 bedroom, so most of the vacationers were couples, and during the week most of us got to know each other and had a few drinks at the pub in the neighboring village. The weather had been fine all week, and even on the last evening as we closed up at the pub, the night was warm, and about 16 of us were walking back along the sandy track to our temporary lodgings. On the way back, someone suggested a midnight barbecue, and within half an hour we had a fire going, with sausages, chops, chunks of steak, and baked potatoes sizzling merrily. With a little digging, we found a few bottles of wine and cans of beer, and the whole thing turned into a little party. There was no music or dancing, but there was plenty of casual conversation. The jokes got more and more risque, and every now and then one of the young couples would disappear into the darkness of the sand dunes behind the fire to the accompaniment of loud, rude comments. At about 1:30, our supply of beer began to run low, and Mary, who had drunk a little more than usual, volunteered to go and rummage through our fridge to see what I could come up with. I happily went to the cottage and liberated 6 cans of beer and another bottle of sparkling booze. But when I returned to the fire, there were only 2 people there. One of the young couple, Nick and Emma. I could hear sounds of running and laughter amongst the dunes, but couldn't see anything, so I asked them what was going on. Nick wasn't too sure, but Emma said she had heard something about hunting. When they came back from their walk on the beach, there were only men at the campfire, and they all ran off as soon as the couple showed up. As she told me about it, I had a curious feeling of excitement. Just before I left, someone was talking about a book they were reading about 18th century France, when the local nobility would summon the young women of a village to a chateau after a good dinner and then let them go into the woods to be chased on horseback by noble gentlemen after a 10-minute start. The prize for catching one of them was pretty obvious. My mouth went dry as I imagined what might be going on in the darkness of the sand dunes. I abandoned my beer and set off, trying to accustom my eyes to the darkness beyond the campfire. Seeing nothing at first, I followed the nearest noise. Then my eyes began to adjust to the night, and I saw a random figure on the crest of a dune, then disappearing into a hollow. There was a shout, then laughter, and then, very excitingly, undoubtedly a woman's squeal. I headed in the direction of the squeal, then realized that if it was someone caught, the reward should be claimed by the catcher, not me. In any case, I reasoned, this wasn't 18th century France, and the reward was unlikely to be anything more than a slobbering kiss. But I wouldn't mind one or two such kisses, especially from one or two of the young wives I'd been admiring for a week. Then I noticed another figure, definitely female, running on my right side, about 50 yards away, and I changed to a trot, heading toward her. She began to disappear down the valley, and then I saw two men running after her, who were clearly running faster than her and were clearly on her tail. They too disappeared into the gully. Then I heard a squeal and, shocked, I realized it was Mary. I increased my speed and ran up the dune, instinctively sinking to the sand when I reached the top. She was standing between two men, each holding one of her wrists. I recognized Peter, a guy of about 35 who, judging by his tan and trim, muscular body, was some kind of construction worker, and Gary, one of the young married men I'd barely spoken to. All three were breathing hard and laughing. "So, Mary," Peter finally said in his deep West Country accent, "we've caught the fox. Time to get even." Mary smiled at him and nodded. "That's a fair cop, Gov," she said, and without thinking, she put her arm around his shoulders and kissed him. Peter straddled her upper body first, then lowered his right arm. She relaxed into him for a couple seconds, then broke the kiss and pulled back, shuddering slightly with laughter. "Good thing I had too much to drink," she giggled. "I hope Alan isn't looking for me." She puffed up her cheeks and turned to Gary. He hugged her rather awkwardly and leaned over to find her mouth. She was only wearing a tank top over her shorts, and he didn't seem to know where to put his hands and finally, like Peter, stopped on her body but not as lewdly as before. The kiss ended and Mary smiled at them, now completely relaxed. "That was great," she said. "A perfect ending to my vacation." My excitement began to subside, and I was about to announce my presence when Peter said, "You wouldn't be so quick to fight off a French milord, Mary." "But you are not a French milord, Peter, are you?" she replied, but made no move to move back to the fire, and Peter moved quickly, his arms sliding around her shoulders, and his mouth closed on hers again. This time the kiss lasted much longer, and when his hand moved down to caress Mary's body, she grimaced slightly but didn't pull it away. Their bodies pressed against each other from chest to thighs, and I began to get aroused. Suddenly Mary jerked away from Peter, her hands flying up his back, just in time to catch the loose ends of the halter ties that Peter had obviously managed to untie while she was locked in his arms. Her fingers worked quickly to tie the ends together again, but just as she finished tying the bow, Peter's arms came around her again, trapping Mary's wrists behind her back. She resisted vigorously, but he held her wrists like a vice-governor and slowly withdrew her hands from the halter, which was now loosely tied behind her. "Come on, Mary," he said quietly and persuasively. "Make it a little exciting. Look, I'm horny." Still holding her hands, he stepped back from her and nodded down at his swim trunks. "No, Peter," she said, but I noticed that her gaze, as if hypnotized, kept stopping on the front of his swim trunks. I, too, was mesmerized by the scene playing out beneath me, and I knew I wouldn't interfere unless Mary was genuinely frightened, and I guessed that at this point, any fear she had was at least paired with arousal. As for me, my arousal was almost painful, and I prayed that Peter would try his luck a little more. Peter glanced at a silent Gary, who was standing off to the side. "Give us a hand, buddy," he said. Gary looked doubtful, and Mary shouted again, "No, you can't." "Come on," Peter urged. "That's not what she meant." He looked at Mary again. "You don't want to, do you?" he asked quietly. "Do I have a choice?" she replied, looking at him with a curious expression on her face. I suddenly realized that she needed to feel compelled, powerless. She wanted to take things further, but she wanted to remain blameless, and I suspected that Peter understood that too. "Well," Peter said, "you can scream." Mary laughed raspily and let out a very faint cry. "I don't think anyone heard," she said in a little girl's voice. Then she took a long, shuddering breath and lowered her eyes to the sand. Peter nodded to Gary, who hesitantly stepped forward and took the ends of Mary's halter straps in his long fingers. He gently pulled them apart, at which point Peter released Mary's wrists. She spread her arms apart, and the halter fell to the sand, revealing her full, firm breasts to Peter's admiring gaze. "Oh, Mary," he sighed, and her eyes met his for a moment, then lowered to her breasts, then back to his face. His hands came up slowly, and his thumbs ran over her breasts. Her eyes closed, and she swayed slightly, then regained her balance. "That feels so good," she murmured, then gasped as his hands fully grasped both of her breasts and gently squeezed them. Behind her, Gary moved forward and tilted his head to kiss the hollow between her neck and shoulder, his hands lightly encircling her waist. I knew that hollow was a sensitive spot, and her trembling with arousal was transmitted to the two excited men. I watched with a dry mouth, mesmerized and very close to the end. I couldn't recall being this excited since the first weeks of our sexual relationship, when Mary's breasts and body were as new to me as they were to the two men who were now exploring them. She leaned back now, resting her head on Gary's chest, and Peter lowered his head, his tongue teasing her breasts. By this time, Mary's head was leaning back and her eyes were closed. Her mouth was open and she was breathing heavily, and her hands were constantly moving over her captor's body, squeezing and stroking them. The next step was probably inevitable. But even so, I watched with a sense of disbelief as Peter's hand moved to the front of Mary's tight beach shorts, and his fingers gently stroked the top of her inner thigh. I saw her flinch at the first tentative touch and instinctively pull away, but Gary visibly loosened his grip and Peter's fingers became more insistent, and gradually Mary relaxed. I could only imagine what he was touching now. Then only the back of his hand became visible, and at the same instant, Mary let out a sigh, and I realized that he had broken the last fragile barrier. His fingers slid down her body, and now she was really trying to protest. "No! Peter, please! No! Not there!" Then she gasped again, and her protest was replaced by pleading. "Oh, Peter, don't!" Mary's hands were now pushing ineptly into Peter's powerful shoulders, but her pleas and protests were interspersed with faint sighs of pleasure. Feeling ashamed, I again convinced myself that I should not interfere, and watched eagerly as Gary inevitably shifted his grip to my wife's upper body, lowering her gently to the sand. When she realized what was happening, another protest escaped the lips of a squirming Mary, but after placing her shoulders on the soft sand, Gary placed his hands on top of theirs and knelt behind her. "Oh, Peter, no, you mustn't," she moaned, but her voice was still low, and Peter smiled as he gently pulled the last remnants of her clothes down over her wriggling hips. Peter was the first to pull off his swim trunks. I expected Mary to protest and struggle, but to my amazement and excitement, I saw her right arm stretch forward as Peter slowly lowered himself to her. If I wanted to stop it, I should have done it now, but the suffocating arousal was making me almost incapable of speech and movement. I lay motionless on the sand, my heart pounding frantically. Gary, realizing that Mary no longer needed to be restrained, focused on fondling her breasts again. Next they had sex, and I just watched. Afterward, when I came to my senses, I looked over the edge of the dune. Gary had his trunks on, and Peter and Mary were lying side by side, facing each other, his hand gently stroking her body. Then he leaned forward, kissed her gently on the lips, and rose to his feet. Finding his swim trunks, he quickly pulled them on, then pulled out Mary's halter top and shorts, and as she stood up, helped her put them back on. No one said anything, and Gary looked very uncomfortable. But when Peter handed Mary her top, he quickly grabbed and squeezed her breasts, and then took her in his arms and hugged her. She hugged him back, then quickly put her top on, and the three of them, holding hands, headed out of the dune, to my right, toward the campfire. It took me another 10 minutes to calm down before I returned, for a much-needed drink. I have often thought back to that night. I had never told Mary about it until now, and neither had she. But soon I think I would be able to persuade her to relive it, and I would feel that thrill of excitement again. The end! Subscribe to my channel! Thank you!